welcome to our talk, our expertise talk for Cumulus Connect. So let me just briefly introduce you. I mean, most people will know you as you're famous in, I think, all continents of the world. You've got a background as an engineer, you have a management education, film studies, interactive media, cognitive sciences, and then sort of user experience actually was something that you were focusing on pretty much, working on IXDA, co-founding, founding, being president actually, and you're super passionate about storytelling and narratives. So this is actually one of the reasons I want to talk to you today. I want to listen to you, more listen to you, to talk about the potential of design narratives and how they can create new possibles actually. So why do you think are those sort of narratives important, especially today in COVID times?
So thanks for having me. And indeed, I'm passionate about narrative and about design. And those are two fuzzy words because depending on the perception, depending on the practice, someone looks at design in some ways and someone looks at narrative in other ways. And I'm fascinated by this fuzziness. And I say, if we put them together, what can it trigger in terms of thinking, in terms of making? And you mentioned COVID today. COVID for me is a fascinating discontinuity moment. And therefore narrative is fundamental because narrative allows to think about the present. We share knowledge, we share emotions. Narrative allows to think about the past. We share experience, and that's how for 10,000 years narrative has been a way to work on the collective with many people. And narrative allows to project oneself into the future. So it's about anticipation. And how do I connect that to design? Design is about anticipation and action. And narrative becomes then a tool to express the modalities of anticipation before going into action. And often I say the first prototype of any design action is a piece of narrative. It's a story. With that story, I can share with you, with the stakeholders, this is what we should do, or this is what we are going to do. Can we feedback? Can we co-design? Can we co-narrate? And that is where I say narrative is not only a set of sequence events, but narrative is more a synthesized set of knowledge and emotion that we are using to push ourselves into what doesn't exist yet. And for me, the essence of design is about thinking and making what doesn't exist yet. And I'm going back to Herbert Simon and the artificial world. It's our job as designers to envision the next, the non-existing. And narrative is the first step in order for that, but not only the first step. In an iterative mode, it allows us to check regularly if what we said that we are going to build fits into the vision of the other stakeholders. And I would push again, telling that user-centered design is too narrow. It was good a few years ago, but today we need to be more critical and say multi-stakeholder design is what we need to work on.
I mean, even Don Norman extended the notion of user-centered design to society, because this was also something that I've been criticizing, from user to human. And I think it's really about society. Would you also include non-human actors in the stakeholder landscape that you're talking about?
Yeah, very much. And I would say what we need to look into is we as human beings, one to one, but we as many human beings, one to many, many to many, and then we in context. And the context has many scales. We in a place, we in many places, like you are in a place, I'm in a place, but our conversation is mediated through technology and this platform. And then what becomes very interesting is cities, we in cities, we in multiple complex spaces. And so what makes a city is many of us coming together, sharing our stories and experience and looking for new experience. And there we get into something which I'm working on, is the notion of hybridity. Mm-hmm. And we get into, if I use a more designerly word, ecosystem. A city is an ecosystem and so forth. And so we need to connect then ecosystem thinking with narrative thinking, with designerly thinking. And that would allow us to push our boundaries of expanding notions of design.
I think the city is a very good example because stakeholders with very different backgrounds, I mean, think of migrations, think of transformations, they come and they share a space actually. So I'm wondering actually, whereas now, I think with COVID-19, sort of we are all very much connected in a new way. We are setting up new relations. So looking at the narratives, you talking about the possible or maybe even the necessary issue of the past, we have very different reference systems in the past if you look at how the people can respond or relate to COVID-19 right now. But in a city, we have a shared space. Right now, we have a sort of a shared challenge. However, actually, do you think that there's a special opportunity for design to really increase the complexity of diversity in your multi-stakeholder projection or perspective in those days where we have the lack of the spatial reference system, for example, of a city, because the global system is way bigger and doesn't allow that much personal encounter?
Yeah, very much. I would say yes. When I'm in being an optimistic, I would say yes. But I think of the past. What are the discontinuities we had these last 40, 50 years? 1973, we had the oil shock. The alarm about the climate change was given then. Were we as a collective be able to listen to that? Not enough. That's why we are here. 1989, we had the Berlin Wall. It changes, another discontinuity. 2008, we had the financial crisis. 2020, we have this one. And I'm forgetting, I'm sure, many others. Mm. And what I'm trying to say, okay, did we as designers take the opportunity to have a greater share of voice in the system? Not enough. Mm. And I was wondering why. And maybe because people, policymakers, decision makers, still think of design being decoration. And we are here having a conversation about design being an intention-centric set of activities, a strategic activity. And so we need to evangelize contemporary notions of design today to policymakers, decision makers, business people. And we have a fantastic sweet spot now. And you being in Cumulus Association, you have a fantastic platform because it goes to 1 million students. And I think it's better to focus on students who will shape the next 10, 15, 20 years. And some of them hopefully will have some decision-making capabilities. So we need to make sure that they don't convey the notion of design of the 70s, 80s, 90s, but design as a spectrum of different activities, which includes some activities of design as known by the wider public. But we are getting into pushy zones where we need to leverage the power of design. And narrative can help into that.
About Cumulus and the sheer power of 1 million students and a huge amount of universities from all over the world. Is there any sort of, I would say idea, maybe even recommendation or comment from your side about how to adjust core issues of the curricula of the universities right now? Because I think in this historic moment in time, there's a great will sort of to rethink the history and don't fall back to the 70s or 80s. I mean, many of the universities obviously are in the now, But the now, looking into the future, is really about a global challenge that we need to address. So is there anything in particular that you need to, that you suggest to be on the agenda actually of the curricula, whether specific in design or in relation of design, because it might also be the, what some people say, the dawn of true interdisciplinarity actually?
I would argue that maybe we need to reinforce the critical toolbox next to the creative toolbox. When we talk about design, or when we talk about art, architecture, media, we talk a lot about creative activities. And I would like to put next to that, more we are critical in a constructive way, more will be creative. And I think the curricula should reflect the ability to reinforce critical thinking. And critical thinking means understanding many things which happened in the past, reframing, repositioning that for the future. That would be one way, and there are some other ways. And what I'm fascinated is the paradox. We talk a lot about creativity, but we see so many complaints. The planet is full of complaint. The planet is eager to have creative activities. And so often I say, next to complain, we need to reframe that into creative and critical activities and push the action-oriented. So to further on your point, design is a fascinating area because it's action-oriented. Buchanan was saying a few years ago, design is doing philosophy with the hands. But you see the gap between design, philosophy, and the hands. And for me, the connector is narrative. Design is doing stories with objects, with emotions, with services, with environment, with context. And it allows us to do the short circuit, because we as designers, we are good into absorbing as a sponge and then come with synthetic thinking, while managers and others are more analytical thinkers. Though as designers, I think we should also be good analytical thinkers. It needs to feed our pipeline. And the magic we can bring is the ability to connect dots which were unforeseen in terms of connections. And that is where narrative plays a fantastic role. And that is where design allows us to be in the action mode and not only blah, blah. Because when I say narrative, yes, it's again another story, another blah, blah. No, design is, the proof is in the pudding. We are doing this. And there comes for me the ethos of design, is the ability of prototyping. If we prototype something, then we create trust with the stakeholder. And if our narrative about the prototype gives the right context, it's done. We are pushing the knowledge boundaries and we are coming with stuff which are relevant to 2020, 2030, 2040. And if I look back, I was telling in a conference, we need to move from the industrial mindset to the iterative mindset. An industrial mindset is top-down, is linear thinking, while iterative mindset is trying to understand what are all the components and what we need to rethink in terms of assemblage. And I was using the word assemblage as putting together stuff in a meaningful way for the next 5 years and re-question that every X years. Is it relevant? Because the focus of design is it appropriate? Is it relevant? If we are able to answer this question regularly, then we are getting into interesting zone. And policy making today is in a problem zone in many countries, in many places, because the notion of appropriateness, of relevancy, is not well addressed. And so you know that many places are having policy and design being interconnected. The European Commission has a policy lab nowadays. Mm-hmm. So they are getting into this kind of tools that we are practicing as designers in order to envision the next. And so we need to push that and see more and more cities and places having policy labs to explore, to try. And we need to move from an era of exploitation if we go back into 70s, 80s, 90s, we have been extracting and exploiting energy and whatever to a mode of exploration and trying to figure what is relevant. And you see that from the two words that we began with, narrative and design, we are talking about systems, we are talking about context, we are talking about the place of people into this context, and we are jumping from many points to the others, but it makes sense because there are a number of assumptions that we are having in our conversation where we know that we don't need to talk of everything in an analytical way. We can be synthetic, we can be allusive, we can be metaphoric, and all these are modes that allows us to accelerate the sharing of knowledge. And that is where I would say, based on your question, narrative is a fantastic tool for us to accelerate our thinking, our tooling, our transforming of what we need to envision.
Well, I think this is really a lot of sort of keywords and food for thought for further discussions, actually. But sort of let me just respond to the, let's call it iteration of the creation of the creative activity that is not self-expression, but that responds to the critical and sort of, while reflecting, creates actually also something new to be sort of critically perceived or inquired. And maybe, and this is something that we discussed in our leadership and strategy session last week, an important point that came up actually, I think that the art and design academies and universities should become again sites of inquiry, actually, sort of to inquire existing and possible realities and to explore maybe modes of collaboration with other stakeholders. And the labs that you've been mentioning are excellent, actually, to connect design again in a new way to society and to sort of politics with the help of narratives, of new narratives. Yeah, so, well, I think that's an encouraging way to think about the future, because we will need sort of new tools, new methods that we already have been trained in, actually, but to adapt, to react to and create this new normal as a possible, as a desirable possible from my perspective.
And there comes, how do we cope with the unknown unknowns? And if we go back to 10,000 years of history, human species has been busy with unknown unknowns. And you have got an accumulation of knowledge which allows to survive. And we should not forget the past, but the long past, because the last 70 years has put us into mono thinking, and we need to go back into plural thinking.
So time to forget about convenience and to really understand or try to explore our past ability to cope with the unknown that we thousands of years ago were trained to in order to survive. So thank you very much, Alok, for this conversation. I would love to proceed. Maybe we have another conversation in the near future. I enjoyed it very much, and thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Philipp.